The Valorian Dominion had not lost a war in 11,000 years, and High Marshal Threxel Veillon intended to keep it that way with the same effort he gave to breathing. He stood on the command dais of the dreadnought Kale Ashura, hands clasped behind the small of his back, watching the tactical plot bloom with 140 starships arranged in the perfect concentric rings of the Veillon Formation, a formation named for his own bloodline 3 centuries ago and unbroken in every engagement since. Behind him, arrayed across 17 light-years of the Talos Reach, the accumulated conquests of 100 campaigns hummed in the background of the Dominion's collective memory, the Ithic assemblies broken in 4 days, the coral kingdoms of Sur Mora annexed without a single Valorian casualty, the Drenic conquered, whose entire battle fleet had been vaporized in an afternoon by a single line of Dominion capital ships firing in sequence, a demonstration so total that the Drenic surrender documents had been signed within the hour, in ink mixed, according to Dominion legend, with the tears of their last admiral. 11,000 years of that. 11,000 years of watching lesser species discover, in the span of a single battle, exactly how small they were. The Kale Ashura herself was a monument to that certainty made physical. 2.1 kilometers of layered ablative plate and reinforced ceramite spine, her forward third a blunt battering ram of shield emitters designed to shrug aside anything a lesser civilization could conceivably throw at her. Her midsection a honeycomb of launch bays and reactor housings capable of sustaining a crew of 11,000 for years without resupply. Her stern trailing the pale blue drive glow of a fusion torch array that had, in the collective memory of every Dominion officer who had ever served aboard her, never once been forced to run at full burn in retreat. She did not maneuver so much as impose herself upon whatever region of space she occupied, and the 10 dreadnoughts flanking her in the Veillon Formation's inner ring were built along the same doctrine in miniature. Overwhelming, visible, unmistakable strength, presented up front and without disguise, because in 11,000 years no enemy fleet had ever required the Dominion to consider hiding anything at all. Now the plot showed a new system, designated Talos 9 by Dominion cartography and called by the insignificant creatures who lived there, Meridian. A yellow star unremarkable. A single gas giant catalogued as Coriolis, a bloated ochre sphere banded in storms, orbited by 41 moons of no strategic value. And closer in, hugging the warm side of the system, a rocky world with 3 continents and 1 modest orbital ring of infrastructure. New Providence, humanity's furthest colony, a scattering of 8 million souls at the extreme edge of a species that called itself, with almost touching self-regard, the human race. Threxel had read the intelligence file twice, mostly out of boredom during the 4-month translation through folded space. Humans. First contact 70 years prior, a brief and unremarkable border skirmish with a Dominion scouting flotilla that had ended, according to the surviving record, in a mutual disengagement, which Threxel understood to be Dominion diplomatic language, for we did not consider it worth our time to finish them. Since then, the species had expanded modestly, fought 2 minor internal conflicts, and settled a handful of colonies along a technological curve that Dominion analysts rated, with the confident precision of a species that had never been wrong about this before, as Class 5. Minimal threat. Comparable to pre-industrial gathering societies with delusions of orbital capability. The file noted, almost as an afterthought, that human vessels used a propulsion signature the Dominion had not fully modeled, and that scans of New Providence showed unusually dense orbital infrastructure for a colony of this population. But the analyst had appended a note dismissing this as civilian redundancy typical of isolated frontier settlements, no combat signatures detected. Threxel had signed off on the assessment without a second thought. He had conquered 100 worlds. He knew what fear looked like on a sensor board, and New Providence's system showed none of it. No military buildup, no defensive posturing, just the quiet, unguarded hum of a colony going about its business, entirely unaware that the largest fleet it would ever see was 4 months out and closing. Marshal, his second fleet commander Resadal, approached the dais with the particular gait of an officer who has practiced looking unbothered. We are 11 hours from Talos 9-system boundary. Vanguard elements report clean approach vectors. No response to our arrival hails, but the colony's civilian broadcast traffic continues uninterrupted. They do not appear to know we are here. They will know soon. And enough, Threxel said, and allowed himself the smallest curl of satisfaction. 11,000 years, and it never grew old, this moment before a new species learned its place in the order of things. Signal the fleet. We proceed in standard first contact posture, weapons at station keeping readiness only. I want the full Vayon formation visible on their sensors the instant we cross the heliopause. Let them see what they are dealing with before we ever speak a word. As you say, Marshal. Ressa hesitated, the way she always did when she had something to add and wasn't certain it was worth his time. The colony's designation, Class 5, it seems, modest for a species that built an orbital ring this dense. Threxel turned to look at her properly, the amused patience of a teacher indulging a promising student. Commander, in 11,000 years has a Class 5 designation ever once been wrong? No, Marshal. Then I imagine it is not wrong today. He turned back to the plot where the icon representing New Providence sat small and defenseless amid the vast dark. Humans have had 70 years to build something to frighten us. They have built weather stations and communication relays. Whatever this world is, Commander, it is not a fortress. It is a farm waiting for someone to come and harvest it. We are simply early to the season. He did not know, could not have known, sitting on his dais 11 hours out from a system he had already decided he understood completely, that the analyst who wrote that intelligence file had been looking at exactly what she was supposed to see, because the New Providence Colonial Defense Authority had spent 4 years, and an obscene fraction of the Sol Compact's defense budget making absolutely certain that she would. The gas giant Coriolis, that fat, unremarkable 41-moon nothing hanging in the outer system, was not empty. Behind its bulk, tucked into the gravitational shadow, where its mass bent space and light and sensor returns into a soup no passive scan could parse cleanly, sat the Meridian Reserve Fleet. 63 vessels under absolute electromagnetic and thermal lockdown, hulls coated in a radar-absorbent ceramic weave developed at the Ganymede shipyards specifically to defeat Dominion long-range scanning suites, running on cold fusion cores throttled down to survival power, crews breathing recycled air in ships that had not so much as pinged a transponder in 11 months. It was the single largest concentration of military force humanity had ever assembled, and it had been sitting silently in the dark, waiting, since before the Dominion fleet had even finished its 4-month transit. And in orbit around New Providence itself, disguised among the weather stations and communication relays and agricultural satellites that Threxel's analyst had so confidently waved away as civilian redundancy, sat 11 objects that were none of those things. They had been built to look like exactly what the Dominion expected to see: bulky, slow, thermally noisy infrastructure, the unglamorous plumbing of a frontier colony. Buried inside each one, behind meters of shielding and beneath a lattice of decoy heat signatures engineered by people who had made a science of understanding exactly what an alien sensor operator would expect and exactly how to give it to them, sat a coilgun-driven railgun battery capable of flinging a depleted uranium slug at 9% of the speed of light, and enough capacitor bank to do it 40 times before needing to recharge. Fleet Admiral Elena Castellano-Reyes had commanded the New Providence Defense Authority for 6 years. Ever since the Sol Compact's Strategic Foresight Division had run the numbers on humanity's first contact and concluded, with the same cold clarity Threxel prized in himself, that any species capable of interstellar travel that found humanity would eventually come calling with intent to conquer, and that the only sane response to a numerically superior, technologically confident aggressor was not to try to match them ship for ship, but to become the last thing they ever expected: A trap so patient, so well disguised, that the enemy would walk into its center convinced they had already won. She stood now in the tactical center buried 400 meters beneath New Providence's capital, watching the same plot Threxel watched, 4 months delayed and 11 hours from real, the icon of the Valorian Dominion fleet crawling toward her colony like a slow, inevitable tide. 140 ships. Her intelligence estimates put Dominion capital ship armor at roughly comparable density to 20th century naval steel, scaled up by 4 orders of magnitude. With directed-energy weapons optimized for engagements against opponents who had never developed kinetic weapons capable of matching relativistic velocities. Because in 11,000 years, apparently none ever had. "They're running the Veillon formation," said her tactical officer, Commander Priya Osai, not looking up from her console. Concentric rings, command ship dead center, point defense screen on the outer ring. Textbook. It's the same formation from the Drennick conquered engagement records we pulled off that trade vessel 3 years back. "Good," Elena said. "Arrogant men don't change their homework." She studied the plot a moment longer, feeling the particular stillness that settled over her before every drill, every simulation, every one of the 411 tabletop exercises her staff had run against this exact scenario over 6 years, refined and refined again until the plan had the polished, inevitable feel of a mathematical proof. Confirmed status. Reserve fleet. Coriolis shadow, full lockdown, 63 hulls, Osai confirmed. Admiral Chen reports all crews at readiness, cores hot on standby, 30-second spin-up to combat power on your mark. They have not been detected. Passive scans of the Dominion fleet show zero indication they know reserve fleet exists. And the platforms. 11 railgun batteries disguised as orbital infrastructure, fully armed capacitor banks at 98% and climbing. Whether Station 7 and the Kestrel Relay Array are our primary Alpha Strike platforms, they have clean firing solutions on projected Dominion Vanguard positions the moment they cross the boundary defined in Operation Anvil's engagement geometry. Osai finally looked up. "Ma'am, they still think we're a farm." "Let them," Elena said. "A farmer who spent 6 years digging tunnels under his fields isn't really a farmer anymore, Commander. He's something else. They'll learn the difference in about 11 hours." She had built this plan on a single, unglamorous insight that the Sol Compact's War College had drilled into every officer since the founding of the Defense Authority. The Dominion's 11,000 unbroken years of victory were not, in fact, evidence of overwhelming strength. They were evidence of an opponent that had never once been forced to innovate, because it had never once faced a species willing to lie about what it was. Every conquered world in that long, grim record had fought honestly, had shown its true capabilities up front, had tried to match Dominion's strength with lesser versions of the same tools, and had lost because there had never been a surprise large enough to matter. Elena did not intend to fight honestly. She intended to make Threxel Veillon believe, right up until the final moment, that he already understood everything about the battlefield in front of him, and then to make him watch as every one of those beliefs was proven catastrophically wrong, one system at a time, in the span of a single afternoon. The Dominion fleet crossed the Talos 9 heliopause at the 11th hour precisely, as Threxel had ordered, blooming into New Providence's sensor net in the terrifying totality he had intended. 140 ships in perfect concentric rings, the Kale Asherah a black spire 2.1 kilometers long at the exact center, flanked by 9 other dreadnoughts barely smaller, ringed by cruisers, ringed again by a screen of 60 light escorts bristling with point defense turrets. The whole formation moving with the unhurried, contemptuous confidence of a species that had never needed to hurry for anyone. On the tactical plots of every human ship and station in the system, the icon cluster that represented the Dominion fleet sat heavy and immense, a wall of iron given motion, exactly the psychological weapon it was designed to be. On New Providence, in the colony's public spaces and its crowded transit hubs and its quiet residential towers, Ordinary civilians who had no idea what their government had spent 6 years building beneath their feet looked up at view screens showing the approaching fleet and felt, for the first time in the colony's 70-year history, the specific cold terror of understanding that they were very small and very alone at the edge of a very large, very old, and very hostile galaxy. Alina had insisted on that authenticity too. The colony's genuine ignorance, its genuine fear, was itself part of the deception. There could be no leak, no rumor, no telltale absence of panic that a sufficiently paranoid Dominion signals analyst might notice and flag as anomalous. Only the 11-member Defense Authority command staff and the crews of the reserve fleet knew the whole shape of the trap. 8 million New Providence colonists watched that fleet arrive believing, correctly as far as they knew, that they were about to be conquered. Threxel opened the channel himself because he always did. It was, he felt, owed to a species on the occasion of its first true understanding of the universe's actual hierarchy. His image resolved on every screen in the New Providence colonial government's communication network, a Valorian in the ceremonial dark plate of a High Marshal, flanked by the projected specter of H. His fleet and his translated voice carried the particular unhurried cadence of a being who had given this speech, in one form or another, perhaps 60 times across 11,000 years. People of New Providence, I am High Marshal Threxel Veillon of the Valorian Dominion. You stand at the edge of 140 warships representing a civilization that has never known defeat in 11,000 years of expansion. Your world has been surveyed, catalogued, and assessed. Your defensive capacity has been measured and found to be without meaningful military value. I offer you the same terms the Dominion has offered 100 worlds before yours. Submit to Dominion administration, surrender your orbital and surface defensive assets for inspection and integration, and your people will be preserved as a productive client population within the Dominion sphere. Resist, and you will be shown, in whatever manner proves necessary, exactly why resistance has never once in 11,000 years produced a different outcome. You have 6 hours to respond. I do not recommend you waste them. The response, when it came, arrived 4 hours and 50 minutes later, close enough to the deadline to read as genuine hesitation, exactly as Alina had planned it. It was not a surrender. It was also not, on its surface, a declaration of war. It was something far more useful, a message calibrated with surgical precision to buy the last critical minutes the operation required. A young colonial administrator, hand-picked and extensively coached by Alina's staff, appeared on the Kale Ashera's bridge screen looking appropriately frightened, voice trembling in a way that was almost, but not quite, entirely performance. High Marshal, this is Deputy Colonial Administrator Amara Field, speaking for New Providence's civilian government. We need more time to convene our full council and prepare terms for an orderly transition. Our infrastructure has emergency shutdown protocols that must be run correctly to avoid civilian casualties during any transfer of control. We are requesting an additional standard day before formal response, and we ask that your fleet hold current position and refrain from closer approach during this period, to avoid triggering automated defensive misfires in our orbital systems that could endanger your own vessels as well as our people. Threxel listened to this with the particular contempt he reserved for prey species that mistook procedural delay for leverage. He glanced at Ressa. They stall, predictable. A dying animal always asks for one more hour. Should we grant it, Marshal? He considered the request for perhaps 4 seconds, weighing it against 11,000 years of pattern. Frightened populations always overnegotiated the terms of their own surrender, imagining that delay constituted resistance. There was no military logic in refusing. The colony posed no threat regardless of how the next day unfolded, and a dominion known for magnanimity toward the conquered was, historically, a dominion whose subsequent conquests went more smoothly. Grant it. Half a day, not a full one. Let them understand that our patience, while real, is not infinite. Advance the fleet to standard blockade posture at the edge of their orbital defense perimeter in the meantime. I want them watching us the entire time they pretend to deliberate. The reserve fleet itself, hidden in the freezing dark behind Coriolis, was a very different kind of monument, one built from a doctrine the Dominion had never once had cause to develop. Where the Veillon formation announced itself, the Meridian Reserve Fleet had been designed from its very first kettle laying to disappear. Hulls faceted and canted at angles calculated to scatter incoming radar returns away from any plausible receiver, drive systems throttled to a bare, whispering fraction of their output, and shrouded in radiator fins that bled waste heat slowly into the gas giant's own considerable thermal noise, rather than venting it in the sharp, telltale bloom any passive Dominion sensor sweep would flag immediately. The 8 Lance-class railgun cruisers at the fleet's spear point were, by Dominion standards, almost absurdly unbalanced vessels. 90% of their internal volume given over to accelerator coil rail, reactor mass, and magazine, with barely enough crew space and point defense capacity to keep the ship alive long enough to fire. They were not built to survive prolonged engagement, only to deliver again and again a single kind of hammer blow that no Dominion shield array had ever been designed to absorb. The 16 drone carriers that trailed them were bulkier, slower, almost ungainly vessels whose entire purpose was to serve as flying magazines for the swarm doctrine, each one capable of disgorging dozens of autonomous strike drones within seconds of an order to engage. It was, in its totality, a fleet built not to look impressive but to be invisible. Ill the precise moment invisibility ceased to matter, and Alina's staff had spent 6 years ensuring that moment would arrive on terms entirely of humanity's choosing. It was, Alina would reflect much later, the single most important tactical error Threxel Veillon made in the entire engagement, though it would not be the last. The decision to advance his fleet closer, into the exact engagement envelope her disguised platforms had been built and positioned to exploit, in order to intimidate a population he believed incapable of striking back. 12 hours of delay was exactly what Reserve Fleet's final positioning calculations needed. 12 hours was exactly enough time for Admiral Chen's 63 ships, still silent and cold behind Coriolis, to complete the last of their firing solution updates against a Dominion formation that had obligingly moved itself into the precise geometric position Alina's staff had spent 6 years designing her defenses around. The 12 hours passed with the Dominion fleet holding blockade position 20 light seconds from New Providence's orbital ring, close enough that individual ship silhouettes resolved clearly on visual sensors, the great dark hull of the Kale Ashura hanging above the planet like a judgment waiting to be pronounced. Aboard New Providence, civilians who could see the fleet with unaided optical enhancement from their apartment windows lived through the longest half-day of their lives, unaware that 400 meters beneath their feet, Alina Castellano-Reyes was running her final systems check with the calm, methodical thoroughness of a surgeon confirming instrument counts before the first incision. OSI final confirmation, Alpha Strike platforms. All 11 online capacitor banks at 100%, firing solutions locked against projected Dominion formation positions at engagement mark. Weather Station 7 has a clean shot on the Kale Ashura herself, Admiral. Direct line, no obstruction. A reserve fleet. 63 hulls, cores spun to full combat readiness the instant you give the order, 30-second window from cold to firing capability. Admiral Chen is standing by. A drone wings. 412 autonomous strike drones prepped in the deployment bays across all reserve fleet carriers, plus the colony's own point defense drone reserve, another 190. Swarm coordination AI is live and synced across the fleet. Osai's hands were steady on her console, but Alina could hear beneath the flatness of the report the same electric stillness she felt in her own chest. 6 years, 411 simulations. And now the real thing, 20 light seconds away, waiting. Then we're ready, Elena said. She keyed the colony-wide administrative channel one final time, the last piece of theater the operation required, and spoke to Threxel Veyon in the voice of a frightened colonial deputy administrator delivering, at long last, her people's answer. High Marshal Threxel Veyon, this is Deputy Administrator Field on behalf of the government and people of New Providence. A pause timed exactly. We have reached our decision. On the Kale Asherah's bridge, Threxel allowed himself a small, satisfied exhale, already composing in his mind the routine notation he would enter into the Dominion's 11,000-year unbroken record of victories. New Providence Human Colony, Class 5 Minimal Threat, surrendered without engagement following standard blockade posture, casualties 0. He gestured for Ressa to open a fleet-wide recording channel, so that the moment of this small, unremarkable conquest would be properly logged. Transmit your terms of surrender, Administrator. The Dominion is prepared to receive them. We're not surrendering, Elena said, in her own voice now, the trembling gone entirely, replaced by something flat and cold and utterly without fear. High Marshal, you built your entire assessment of this system on the assumption that anything you couldn't immediately identify as a weapon wasn't one. I'd like you to look very closely, right now, at every piece of orbital infrastructure your sensors have spent the last day and a half politely ignoring. Because in about 4 seconds, all of it is going to open fire. Threxel's translated voice carried a half-second of genuine confusion, the first uncertain sound he had made in the entire encounter. What? He never finished the word. At Weather Station 7, a piece of infrastructure the Dominion's intelligence file had described as meteorological monitoring equipment. No combat signature detected. 4 meters of ceramic composite housing split open along seams engineered specifically not to appear as seams under any Dominion scanning wavelength. And a railgun with a barrel length of 80 meters, charged for the better part of a day at full capacitor saturation. Fired a depleted uranium penetrator, the mass of a small ground car at 9% of light speed, directly NTO, the unshielded flank of the Dominion cruiser Ussel Koreth, which had drifted, in the idle repositioning of the last 12 hours, precisely into the platform's optimal firing angle. The penetrator did not explode on impact, because it did not need to. Kinetic energy at that velocity converted instantaneously and totally into heat and shockwave inside the cruiser's hull. And the Ussel Koreth did not so much detonate as cease to cohere, its 200-meter length unraveling into a spreading cloud of molten debris and superheated gas in less time than it took the human eye to register that anything had happened at all. 10 more railgun platforms fired within the same second, each hidden inside a piece of infrastructure the Dominion had catalogued as harmless. A communications relay, an agricultural satellite, a weather buoy, a debris tracking station, each one splitting open to reveal weapons that had been sitting, armed and patient, in plain sight for the entire duration of the Dominion's approach. Kestrel Relay's shot took the cruiser Dreeth Ilan through her engineering section and out the other side, venting her reactor core in a bloom of blue-white light that briefly outshone the system's own sun. A third platform's penetrator missed its primary target and continued on, unimpeded by the vacuum of space, to punch cleanly through the light escort Nuri vest nearly 400 kilometers beyond. An unintended second kill delivered by simple, brutal relativistic physics. In the space of 4 seconds, 11 railgun strikes had gutted or destroyed 6 Dominion vessels, and every one of the weather stations and communication relays surrounding New Providence had been revealed as exactly what they were. On the Kale Asherah's bridge, alarms that had never once sounded in Threxel Veyon's 40-year career screamed in overlapping chaos as the tactical plot, which had shown a passive, defenseless colony for a day and a half, redrew itself in real time into something unrecognizable. 11 weapons platforms where there had been 11 pieces of civilian infrastructure, 6 capital-grade Dominion warships gone or crippled in the time it took to draw a breath, And worse, so much worse, a second wave of icons blooming into existence from the direction of the outer system's gas giant. 63 ships that had not existed on any Dominion sensor sweep an instant before, now burning hard toward the Dominion formation with their weapons already hot. That's not possible, Ressa said, staring at the plot with an expression Threxel had never seen on her before. Marshal the gas giant Coriolis. There's an entire fleet coming out from behind Coriolis' 63 signatures. They weren't there. There is no way they weren't there. They were there the entire time, Threxel said, and heard distantly the strange flat calm in his own voice. The sound of a man's mind trying to hold together a picture of the universe that had just been proven false in every particular. 11,000 years. 11,000 years of Class 5 designations that had never once been wrong. And this world, this insignificant farm at the edge of nowhere, had spent however many years hiding 63 warships behind a gas giant and 11 railgun batteries inside its own colonial infrastructure, waiting, with a patience that no Dominion intelligence assessment had ever imagined a minimal threat species capable of for exactly this moment. Admiral Elena Castellano-Reyes watched her tactical plot from 400 meters beneath New Providence's surface with the same flat, focused calm she had carried through 6 years of preparation, 411 simulations, and the longest 12 hours of waiting she had ever endured, and gave the order that reserve fleet had been built, in every sense, to execute. Admiral Chen, this is Castellano-Reyes. Alpha strike is confirmed, 6 Dominion hulls destroyed or disabled, formation integrity broken. Execute Operation Anvil full engagement, bring the hammer down. 63 ships that had spent 11 months in silent lockdown behind Coriolis's bulk erupted from stealth in a single coordinated burn, their cold fusion cores spinning from throttled survival power to full combat output in the 30 seconds OSI had promised, running signatures blazing now with no further reason for concealment. At the formation's heart moved the 8 vessels of the Sol Compact's Lance-class railgun cruisers, ships built around nothing but a single enormous coilgun accelerator and the reactor mass required to feed it, each one capable of the same relativistic kinetic strikes that had just gutted 6 Dominion cruisers from ambush, now closing to engagement range against a formation that no longer had any illusions left to hide behind. Around them burned the 16 ships of the drone carrier wing, already spitting their payload into the dark, 412 autonomous strike drone. Each one a meter-long dart of ablative armor and a single fusion-pumped micro-warhead, deploying in the swarming, decentralized attack pattern that Sol Compact Doctrine had spent 2 decades refining specifically to overwhelm point defense systems designed to track and destroy centralized, predictable threats. And at the center of the human formation, the reserve fleet's crown jewel. The battlecruiser Ansel Adams-class vessel Prometheus's Reach, carrying in her forward hull a weapon the Dominion had never encountered in 11,000 years of conquest and had no defensive doctrine to counter, because no species it had ever fought had been willing to build one, a nuclear-pumped X-ray laser array. A weapon that used the detonation of a small fission device to pump a bundle of lasing rods into a coherent burst of X-ray radiation, focused with such precision that it could punch through meters of the densest armor the Dominion had ever fielded, single-use, catastrophically destructive, and utterly without any of the graceful continuous beam signature that Dominion point defense systems were tuned to detect and intercept. Ranging complete, came the voice of Prometheus's Reach's weapons officer, Lieutenant Commander Toma Ibori, over the reserve fleet tactical net. Firing solution locked on Dominion flagship Kale Ashura. She's still holding center formation. Admiral hasn't moved. I don't think they've processed what's happening to them yet. Fire when ready, Chen's voice replied, and across the dark between the 2 fleets, Prometheus's Reach's forward hull split open along lines of hidden ordnance bays, and the first of her 3 onboard warheads detonated in a chamber lined with dozens of lasing rods, converting the fury of a small nuclear blast into a single focused lance of X-ray energy that crossed the intervening distance in less time than any human aboard either fleet could consciously register, and struck the Kale Ashura's forward shield emitter array at a point Elena's targeting analyst had identified. From 3 years of painstaking passive sensor study of captured Dominion trade vessel hull schematics, as the single densest concentration of critical systems on the entire 2.1-kilometer hull. The Kale Ashura's shields, generated by a system built to disperse conventional energy weapons and absorb sustained kinetic bombardment, had never been designed to survive a single instantaneous pulse of hard X-ray radiation carrying the energy output of a small tactical nuclear device, concentrated into a beam a few meters wide. The shield emitter array did not merely fail. It vaporized along with 40 meters of hull plating behind it, and the beam, continuing on unimpeded through the wound it had carved, tore through 3 decks of forward crew quarters, a secondary reactor conduit, and the primary sensor processing core before finally dissipating its energy in the ship's inner hull structure, leaving the Dominion flagship venting atmosphere from a wound the size of a small building, and blind across nearly a third of her forward sensor arc. On the Kale Ashura's bridge, Threxel Veyon felt the deck shudder beneath his feet for the first time in his career, and heard through the ship's damage control channel a young engineering officer's voice cracking with a fear that Threxel recognized with a distant and horrified clarity, as an emotion he had spent his entire career inflicting on others and had never once in 11,000 years of Dominion history expected to hear echoed back at his own ship. Marshal, forward shield generation is gone. I mean gone. There's nothing left of the emitter array. We've lost primary sensors on the forward arc. Decks 9 through 14 are open to vacuum. We have crew trapped in. Casualties later, Threxel said, though his voice had lost the unshakable calm of the man who had opened this engagement 11,000 years of victory ago and stood now, less than a minute into a battle he had not believed possible, watching his flagship bleed atmosphere and his formation dissolve into chaos on every screen around him. Formation status. Give me formation status. It was Ressa who answered, and her voice too had changed, had lost the polished unbotheredness she practiced so carefully and settled instead into the flat, rapid cadence of an officer reciting a catastrophe she could not yet fully process. Marshal, we've lost the Ussel Koreth, the Dreeth Ilan, and the Nurives outright gone, no survivors detected. The cruisers Hessa Morn and Itrel Cade are reporting critical hull breaches from the initial railgun volley. Both are losing structural integrity. Hessa Morn's captain is requesting permission to evacuate crew to escape pods. The human reserve fleet, 63 vessels, has crossed the gas giant's shadow and is closing on our position at high burn, and their drone carriers have released Marshal. I'm reading over 400 small autonom. O's contacts, they're not following any coordinated attack vector we have modeled. They're swarming, Marshal, independent targeting. Our point defense computers are struggling to prioritize threats. There are simply too many discrete targets. She was not exaggerating. The 412 strike drones released from the Sol Compact's carrier wing had been built around a doctrine born directly out of humanity's own turbulent 20th and 21st century experience with asymmetric warfare. A doctrine the Dominion, with its 11,000 years of engagements against species that fielded conventional centralized fleets and predictable tactics, had never once been forced to develop a counter for. Dominion point defense systems, exquisitely refined over millennia to track and intercept incoming capital ship weapons fire and small numbers of coordinated fighter craft, were built on targeting priority algorithms that assumed an attacking force of, at most, a few dozen discrete threats requiring careful individual tracking and interception. They had never been designed to process 412 independent, erratically maneuvering targets converging from every conceivable angle simultaneously, each one small enough and fast enough to individually resemble sensor noise, collectively representing an attack density that simply overwhelmed the processing bandwidth of every targeting computer in the Dominion fleet within the first 90 seconds of the drone's deployment. The drones swarmed the outer ring of the Veyon formation first, the light escorts whose point defense turrets were meant to be the fleet's shield against exactly this kind of small craft threat, and the escort's defensive computers, faced with hundreds of targets where their design specifications had promised dozens at most, began making the kind of triage decisions that no Dominion engineer had ever tested under real combat conditions. Prioritizing the nearest threats, then the fastest, then simply defaulting to whatever targeting solution resolved first. A cascading failure of doctrine that let more than 60% of the drone swarms first wave punch through the outer screen entirely unintercepted and detonate their fusion-pumped warheads directly against escort hull plating never designed to withstand concentrated small craft ordnance delivered in such overwhelming numbers. 11 light escorts died in the first 90 seconds of the drone engagement alone, their hulls shredded not by any single catastrophic weapon, but by the cumulative, saturating violence of dozens of small warheads, each individually survivable and collectively lethal. Sound general engagement, Threxel said, forcing the words out through what felt, for the first time in his career, like genuine physical effort. All ships, independent fire authorization, defend formation integrity by whatever means available. Concentrate point defense fire on the drone's swarm, prioritize, he stopped. Because there was no coherent priority to give, no clean doctrine to fall back on. Only the terrible realization settling into him with each passing second that every tool in the Dominion's 11,000-year arsenal had been built to fight an enemy that fought honestly, that showed you what it had, that let you plan against known quantities. And that the humans of New Providence had built their entire defense around the opposite principle. Hide everything, show nothing, and let the enemy's own confidence do the work of destroying itself. The battle that followed, which Saul compact historians would later name the Battle of the Coriolis Shadow, unfolded over the next 4 hours in a widening arc of destruction that moved, with a kind of terrible mathematical inevitability, entirely in humanity's favor. The Lance-class railgun cruisers of Chen's reserve fleet, having closed to optimal engagement range, began methodically working through the Dominion formation's cruiser screen with the same relativistic kinetic strikes that had shattered the Vanguard, each hit converting instantaneously into a localized catastrophe of heat and structural failure that Dominion shields, tuned for energy weapon dispersal, simply could not meaningfully mitigate. Dominion doctrine called for concentrated point defense fire against incoming projectiles, a tactic that worked adequately against slower conventional munitions, but proved almost entirely useless against penetrators moving at 9% of light speed, which covered the distance from a Lance cruiser's muzzle to a Dominion hull in a fraction of a second too brief for any interception system, however sophisticated, to meaningfully react. Threxel watched his cruiser screen die in a slow, grinding sequence of individual disasters relayed to his bridge in fragments. The Kessa Thil struck through her primary reactor housing, venting plasma in a spreading corona before her containment finally failed entirely, and she came apart. Silent, absolute fire. The Orin Vash, her engines gutted by a penetrator that had entered through her stern and traveled the length of her hull before exiting through her bow, leaving her a drifting, powerless hulk immediately swarmed by a fresh wave of human strike drones that finished what the railgun strike had started. The Ithel Corin, whose captain, in a moment of genuine tactical improvisation that Threxel would later reflect, was the single most competent thing any Dominion officer did in the entire engagement, attempted to angle his ship to present minimum cross-section to the human railgun cruisers, a maneuver that bought him perhaps 90 additional seconds before a drone swarm found his exposed engine section and ended him anyway. It was not, Threxel understood with a clarity that felt almost like physical pain, a battle in any sense the Dominion had ever fought before. There was no dramatic clash of comparable forces, no back-and-forth exchange of advantage that a skilled commander might turn through cleverness or valor. It was closer to watching a demolition, a structure that had stood in the Dominion's collective certainty for 11,000 years, being methodically, deliberately, almost bureaucratically taken apart by an enemy who had clearly spent years planning the precise sequence of that demolition, and had simply been waiting, with a patience the Dominion's intelligence services had never once imagined a Class 5 minimal threat species capable of sustaining, for the Dominion itself to walk into position. 2 hours into the engagement, with 40% of his fleet destroyed or disabled, and the human reserve fleet showing no sign of taking meaningful losses in return, Threxel made the first genuinely defensive decision of his career and ordered the remaining Dominion formation to fall back toward the system's inner boundary, hoping to buy distance and time to reorganize a coherent defensive posture. It was, in the abstract, a sound instinct. It was also precisely the response Elena Castellano-Reyes' staff had modeled and planned for across dozens of their 411 simulations, because a fleeing formation presented exactly the kind of extended, strung-out target profile that reserve fleet's railgun cruisers were built to exploit, each Dominion ship forced to expose its full profile, as it attempted to disengage rather than presenting the tighter, mutually supporting cross-section of an intact formation. "They're breaking for the outer boundary," Osai reported from the tactical center beneath New Providence, watching the plot with the focused intensity of an officer seeing a plan she had rehearsed dozens of times finally play out in reality. "Admiral, this is the exact retreat vector we modeled in Simulation 218. Recommend reserve fleet execute the pursuit envelope now before they can establish a coherent rearguard." "Do it," Elena said. "Chen, execute pursuit envelope Bravo. Don't let them regroup. Every minute we give them to organize a defense is a minute they might find something we haven't already planned for." There was, in truth, very little the Dominion fleet could have found. Chen's cruisers pressed the pursuit with the same cold, methodical precision that had characterized the entire engagement, picking off the slower and more heavily damaged Dominion vessels first, driving the survivors into ever tighter and more desperate formations that only made them better targets for the drone wings still hunting in their overwhelming, decentralized swarms. By the third hour of the engagement, the once magnificent 140-ship Veillon formation had been reduced to a ragged cluster of 31 surviving vessels, more than half of them carrying serious battle damage, clustered defensively around the wounded venting hulk of the Kale Ashura herself, which had lost, in addition to her forward shield array and sensor suite, both of her secondary reactor cores and roughly a third of her crew complement to the accumulated damage of railgun strikes. Drone swarm penetration, and the cascading structural failures that came from trying to hold a 2.1-kilometer warship together, after the kind of punishment she had absorbed. Threxel stood on his bridge amid the acrid smell of scorched electronics and the low, constant tremor of a ship fighting to maintain structural cohesion, and understood with the specific and total clarity of a man watching the exact moment his entire worldview collapsed, that there was no reorganization available to him, no clever tactical adjustment, no reserve of Dominion technological superiority waiting to be unveiled that would reverse what had happened in the last 3 hours. 11,000 years of unbroken victory had been built. He now understood far too late to matter, on an assumption so fundamental that no Dominion officer had ever thought to question it, that every enemy the Dominion faced would fight with the same hoe. Nest visible, comparably scaled forces the Dominion itself fielded, because every enemy the Dominion had ever faced had done exactly that. Humanity had simply declined to play by that unspoken rule, had spent years building an entire colony's worth of infrastructure as a lie, had hidden a fleet the size of the one now grinding his own to wreckage behind a gas giant for the better part of a year, and had done it all with a patience and discipline that no Class 5 minimal threat assessment had ever accounted for. Marshal, Ressa's voice when it came, had lost every trace of the careful composure she had carried into this engagement 11,000 years of Dominion certainty ago. "Structural integrity is failing across decks 4 through 9. We've lost contact with engineering. Commander Ussel reports the secondary hull is beginning to fold along the frame at Station 212. Marshal, if we do not disengage in the next several minutes, this ship will not survive regardless of what the humans choose to do next. Threxall looked at the tactical plot one final time, at the pitiful cluster of 31 surviving ships arrayed protectively, uselessly, around a flagship that was dying anyway, and at the 63 human vessels closing the last of the distance with the unhurried, methodical confidence of an enemy that had never once, in the entire engagement, needed to hurry. Because the outcome had been decided the moment the Dominion fleet crossed the Talos 9 heliopause, believing it understood everything about the world it was about to conquer. "Open a channel," he said, and the words tasted, in a way he had never once imagined they could, like ash, to the human command. Alina Castellano-Reyes received the hail in the same tactical center she had occupied for the entire engagement, 400 meters beneath a colony whose 8 million residents had spent the last 4 hours believing, with growing and then finally disbelieving relief, that some miracle had turned back an invasion they had expected to end their entire world. She looked at the incoming signal request, glanced once at Osai, who nodded and opened the channel. Threxall Veyon's face resolved on her display, and it was, Alina noted with the clinical distance of a commander assessing an enemy rather than the satisfaction of a victor, a face that had visibly aged in the last 4 hours, the composed and contemptuous authority of the man who had opened this engagement replaced by something hollowed out and stripped bare, a man confronting, for what she suspected was the first time in his entire life, the possibility that everything he had believed about his place in the universe's hierarchy might simply be wrong. "Admiral," Threxall said, and even the translation software rendered the word with a rawness that hadn't been there before. "I am High Marshal Threxall Veyon, commanding what remains of the Dominion Talos Reach fleet. I am requesting terms." Admiral Alina Castellano-Reyes knew Providence Defense Authority. She let the silence hold for exactly as long as it needed to, not out of cruelty, but out of the same cold precision that had governed every decision of the last 6 years. "You have 31 surviving vessels, High Marshal, more than half of them combat ineffective. My reserve fleet has sustained minimal losses and holds full firing solutions on every remaining ship in your formation, including your flagship. I am prepared to accept your surrender under the following terms. All Dominion vessels will power down weapons systems and shield generators immediately and hold position for boarding and inspection. Your fleet's databases, including all navigational, strategic, and intelligence records pertaining to the Dominion homeworld and its holdings, will be made available to Sol Compact analysts. Surviving crew will be treated according to the protections of interstellar convention as prisoners of a concluded engagement, pending negotiation of a broader ceasefire between your government and the Sol Compact. Refuse these terms, High Marshal, and I assure you my fleet has more than sufficient remaining ordnance to finish what your intelligence assessment apparently believed was not possible to begin." Threxall was silent for a long moment, and Alina watched without any particular satisfaction the specific process of a man recalculating, in real time, the entire architecture of his understanding of the galaxy. 11,000 years of Dominion doctrine held that surrender was always, eventually, the rational choice of the weaker party, the acknowledgement of an obvious hierarchy of strength. What it had never accounted for was the possibility of being the party forced to make that acknowledgement, of standing on the losing end of a hierarchy the Dominion itself had spent 11 millennia constructing and enforcing. "You designated us Class 5, Alina added, not unkindly, because there was no need for cruelty in a victory this total only C. Larity minimal threat. I've read the file your analysts filed on my colony, High Marshal. It's a remarkably thorough document. It notes our propulsion signatures were unfamiliar. It notes our orbital infrastructure was unusually dense. And then it concludes on the strength of 11,000 years of a pattern that had simply never once been tested by a species willing to lie about what it was, that none of that mattered. We spent 6 years and most of our colonial defense budget making sure your analyst saw exactly what she expected to see. That's not a failure of your intelligence service, High Marshal. It's a failure of a doctrine that never once considered the possibility of an opponent who understood exactly how you gather intelligence and built a colony specifically to feed you a lie you'd never think to question. 11,000 years, Threxel said, and his voice, when it came, carried none of the contempt it had held 4 hours earlier, only a kind of stunned, hollowed-out arithmetic. 11,000 years, Admiral, and no species has ever done this to us before. No species has ever had reason to develop a doctrine specifically built around your blind spots before, Elena said. You've spent 11,000 years fighting people who showed you what they had. We spent 6 years making very sure we never would. I'd encourage your government, High Marshal, to update its classification system. I don't think Class 5 is going to hold up well under review. The surrender that followed carried none of the ceremonial drama that Threxel had, in the abstract, always imagined attending the collapse of a conquered civilization. It was instead a matter of quiet, methodical procedure. 31 Dominion vessels powering down their weapons and shield generators one by one under the patient, watchful eye of a human fleet that never once relaxed its own readiness. Boarding parties from Chen's reserve fleet moving through Dominion corridors that had never in their history been walked by an alien boot, cataloging databases and weapons systems, and the small, human familiar debris of a defeated crew's daily life, with the same cold thoroughness the Dominion itself had brought to 100 conquered worlds. Threxel stood on the ruined bridge of the Kale Ashura as the boarding party's senior officer, a young human commander who could not have been more than 30 years old by whatever standard the Dominion used to measure such things, formally accepted his surrender, and felt, in a way he suspected he would spend the remainder of his life trying and failing to properly articulate to whatever remained of the Dominion's high command. The specific and total vertigo of a man discovering that the floor beneath 11,000 years of certainty had simply never been as solid as he believed. The formal transmission back to the Dominion homeworld, sent 4 months later once the Kale Ashura's surviving communications array had been repaired sufficiently to carry a signal across the folded space relay network, was the shortest report Threxel had filed in his entire career, and the only one in Dominion history to carry the notation his clerks would later be instructed, on explicit orders from a Dominion high command still struggling to process what had happened, never to repeat aloud in any official proceeding. Fleet strength 140 vessels committed, fleet strength 31 vessels surviving, engagement outcome unconditional surrender, enemy classification requiring immediate and total revision. Class 5 minimal threat, it turned out, had never been a description of humanity's actual capability at all. It had been a description of what humanity had wanted the Dominion to see, patiently constructed over years by a species that had understood, long before the Dominion ever crossed into their system, that the most dangerous weapon in any war was not the size of your fleet but the quality of the lie you told about it, and the discipline to hold that lie steady until the precise moment your enemy's own confidence delivered them into exactly the trap you had spent years building for them. Word of the Battle of the Coriolis shadow spread through the Dominion's client worlds and border territories in the months that followed with the particular speed reserved for stories that overturn assumptions a civilization has spent millennia treating as immutable law. And by the time the first formal Dominion diplomatic delegation arrived at New Providence 8 months later to negotiate the terms of a lasting peace, the story preceding them had already been reshaped. In the retelling of 100 species who had spent centuries or millennia under Dominion domination, into something that carried the particular electric charge of a myth in the process of being born. The tale of the farm that was never a farm at all, the frontier world that led an empire march an unbroken 11,000-year record of victory, directly into a trap disguised as its own unguarded weakness, and watched with cold and patient precision as that empire's own arrogance did most of the work of its defeat. New Providence's Defense Authority never released official casualty figures for the engagement. In keeping with a policy of strategic ambiguity Elena Castellano Reyes had insisted upon from the very first day of the operation's planning, on the theory that an enemy who could not be entirely certain how much of humanity's true capability had been revealed in a single battle would think considerably harder before testing what remained hidden. It was, in its own way, the final and most enduring piece of the deception. Even in total, overwhelming victory, humanity made absolutely certain that no one, not the defeated Dominion, not the client worlds now reconsidering the permanence of their own subjugation, not even its own allies within the wider Sol Compact, ever learned the complete truth of exactly how much more New Providence had been prepared to unleash, had the Dominion's arrogance required it. Elena Castellano Reyes stood, 6 months after the engagement's end, in the same tactical center 400 meters beneath a colony that had gone back, with the particular resilience of populations that survive existential threats, to the unremarkable business of ordinary life, and looked at a star map that had been quietly redrawn across every strategic planning office in known space. New Providence's designation updated from a footnote at the edge of human expansion to something else entirely. A name that traveled now attached to a caution every serious analyst in every serious government would append to any future assessment of humanity's capability. Assume nothing about what you cannot verify directly, and assume, above all, that what a species chooses to show you is very rarely the whole of what it has chosen to hide. Somewhere beyond the gas giant Coriolis, still bloated and ochre and banded in storms exactly as it had been for the entirety of the system's uneventful geological history, a new generation of reserve fleet vessels was already under construction in shipyards no Dominion analyst, or any analyst from any civilization now watching humanity with newly cautious eyes, had yet found reason to suspect existed at all. The lesson of New Providence, Elena reflected, watching the quiet green trace of her colony's ordinary daily traffic scroll across a display that had shown 6 months earlier. The largest fleet humanity had ever faced burn itself apart against a trap 11,000 years of unbroken victory had never once prepared it to imagine, was not that humanity had won a single extraordinary battle through a single extraordinary trick. It was that an empire which had never lost could not, by the very nature of that unbroken record, ever truly learn to expect to. Humanity had built its entire strategic doctrine on the opposite premise, on the cold, patient assumption that every advantage it held today might one day be tested and found wanting, and had therefore never stopped building, never stopped hiding, never stopped preparing quietly for the next arrogant fleet that would someday look at a small, unassuming colony at the edge of known space and see, exactly as the Dominion once had, nothing worth fearing at all.